apart from a couple of cats, we're going to try and read chapter 12, which is called Politics. Woo. Section 1, Standing Tall When Everyone Else is on Their Knees in Worship. The year was 1933. Germany was desperate. In the aftermath of their defeat in the Great War, high unemployment, suffocating debt, and an out-of-control currency had left people's life savings in shatters. In the midst of the chaos, one candidate's frightening vision stood out, overshadowing his political party's shady past. When the votes were counted, the National Socialist Party had won 33%, enough to make Adolf Hitler Reich Chancellor. It was a disaster wearing the mask of triumph. The Nazis were thugs. As best-selling author Eric Metaxas ominously phrased it, in the babble of their clamoring, they had summoned the devil himself, for there now rose up from the deep wound in the national psyche something strange and terrible and compelling. Hitler's title Führer simply means leader in German, but it signifies so much more. Channeling the ancient spirit of German nationalism, Hitler was essentially saying to the nation, I am your father, I am your God, I am all-powerful and indeed the very source of all power. According to Metaxas, Hitler was a symbol who symbolized himself. For the next 5 years he grew in power. Having invested him with supreme authority, the German people expected miraculous results, and Hitler seemed to deliver sensationally, restoring the economy and renewing German confidence. But a bad seed produces bad fruit, and those who plant it reap the harvest they deserve. So it was with Germany and ultimately all of Europe. Looking back, it seems self-evident that Hitler was beastly. But could anyone have known this 5 years before he ignited war and exterminated millions? Dietrich Bonhoeffer was one who saw the writing on the wall. Though he was a pastor, not a political leader, Bonhoeffer knew the Führer principle would be catastrophic. He had to speak out. But what can one pastor do? Hitler had taught that religion should be kept out of politics, and the people believed him. Any words Bonhoeffer spoke would merely condemn him as out of touch. In spite of his reservations, Bonhoeffer voiced his concerns in a 1933 radio address, warning that the image of the leader, Führer, will gradually become the image of the misleader, the Wehrführer. He stated that the true leader must always be able to disillusion. It is just this that is his responsibility and his real object. He must lead his following away from the authority of his person to the recognition of the real authority of orders and offices. A true leader doesn't gather power and lord it over others. He serves. All other paths lead to perdition. Mysteriously, Bonhoeffer's microphone was shut off during the broadcast. He was now on Hitler's radar. He would be watched. Offered safety in America, Bonhoeffer traveled to New York, but after a short time he regretted his decision. I've come to the conclusion that I have made a mistake in coming to America, he wrote. I must live through this difficult period of our national history with the Christian people of Germany. Returning home, Bonhoeffer crossed the line, joining the Abwehr, the German military intelligence organization, as a double agent who intended to conspire against Hitler. On the outside, he played a fawning and naive pastor, convincing people he was loyal to his Führer. Behind the scenes, though, Bonhoeffer was helping plan the Führer's assassination. The attempt failed. Bonhoeffer was caught, sentenced to prison, and executed on April 9, 1945, just days before the Allies defeated Germany. Though Bonhoeffer was widely admired as a martyr, his approach still raises questions. What role ought Christians to have in resisting political leaders they believe are engaged in evil? And in view of our own times, could we muster the will to stand against powerful and popular political leaders? Beneath these questions is a more basic one. Should Christians even bother with politics in the first place? And if so, how do they remain faithful to Christ in the process? While the church is growing in Africa and South America, it's losing influence in the United States. More and more people think the church should mind its own business and leave politics alone. Indeed, many people increasingly support punishing the church for not conforming to current notions about issues like same-sex marriage. The question of Christianity and politics has always been hard. It's harder now with a growing paganism and a state that demands ever more in taxes and obedience to politically correct demands. Will the church bow too, or will we be like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who, when King Nebuchadnezzar commanded them to bow to his image, replied, "Be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." As Eric Metaxas notes, the church is the institution that asks of the state whether its actions tend toward law and order or lawlessness and disorder. It is the church's role to help the state be the state, he says. If the church steps away from this role, who will stand against the gods of power and their tyrannical ambitions? To answer these perplexing questions, we'll look at the nature of politics, what politics is, as well as the accusations other worldviews make to keep Christians on the sidelines. We'll also explore whether there is even such a thing as a coherent Christian worldview of political involvement, and how Christians ought to act differently if there is. 2. What is the problem? What is politics? Polis is the Greek word for city or community, and politikos means of or relating to the citizens within a community. Politics then seeks to answer the question, what is the best way to use power to organize community for the citizens? The United States, as you may know from government class in school, is organized as a constitutional republic. It's a democracy, from the Greek word for rule of the people, but not in the sense that everyone decides everything. Rather, it's a republic, from the Latin for the state is the public's interest. Citizens elect representatives. These representatives are to follow the United States Constitution in establishing and enforcing laws that promote orderly and just governance. In fact, the Latin word for law, legum, is where we get our words legislate and legislature. In a constitutional republic, citizens willingly constrain their own freedom for the greater good. As the Roman statesman Cicero claimed, legum serve sum us ut liberi esse poissimus, which I'm sure he said it much better, but it means we are slaves of the law so that we may be free. It seems paradoxical to use freedom to constrain freedom, but long experience has shown that unless we exercise discipline individually and as communities, tyranny will be our lot. As Edmund Burke said, society cannot exist unless a controlling power upon will and appetite be placed somewhere, and the less of it there is within, the more there must be without. It is ordained in the eternal constitution of things that men of intemperate minds cannot be free. Their passions forego their fetters. Upon a firm foundation of self-discipline, citizens willingly give up some of their freedom and choose representatives to ensure that the Constitution is followed. Although it's less than perfect in America, that's what government and politics have been all about. People form civil governments at the federal, state, and local levels to establish order and justice. Each governmental unit operates inside certain boundaries, using the authority the people have given them. Lawmakers, legislators establish administrative bureaus to carry out the laws they pass. Usually these bureaus have clear jurisdictions, from the Latin for law and se, that speak the law to maintain order and justice. Every time you get a drink of water, flush the toilet, or turn on the lights, or drive down the street, you're using services these administrative bureaus provide, funded with agreed upon taxes and fees. People who operate these bureaus are called bureaucrats, from the French for the power of the desk. You've probably heard the term bureaucrat used derisively. That's because administrative bureaus often create so many rules and regulations that order and justice get bogged down in red tape, a term harkening back to a custom of bundling government documents with red ribbon. It's an ever-present problem. How do we set up enough rules to to keep things from getting out of control without setting up so many that people just start ignoring them. One of the ironies of modern government is that attempts to secure order and justice, when bungled, can result in greater disorder and injustice. Laws securing the power of various government agencies are taken very seriously. I learned this as a teenager when I got pulled over by someone I thought was a police officer. The man wasn't wearing a uniform, and when he walked up and pulled out a badge, I sensed something was wrong. "Where's your uniform?" I asked. "I'm undercover," he replied. After a brief conversation, I realized something was amiss and drove away. The next day, I filed a complaint. The police investigated and found that the person who had pulled me over was a prankster impersonating a police officer. He might have thought it was funny, but the police weren't amused, and they charged him with very serious crimes. I now understand why. If someone illegitimately claims power, it compromises the power of governmental units to enforce the law. When government is working properly, legislators stay attuned to the will of the people and establish orderly and just laws. Administrative bureaus carry out these laws respectfully and efficiently within clear boundaries, recognizing that government exists to serve citizens, not the other way around. But as we all know, reality often doesn't turn out this way. If you've ever tried to get a driver's license, you've probably encountered bureaucrats who seemed overwhelmed, resigned to inefficiency, and grumpy. But public servants aren't excused for acting this way. People are policy. If government doesn't work the way it's supposed to, it is a worldview problem. Either people have the wrong worldview or they lack the will or ability to practice the right one. Someone's worldview assumptions will govern. If these assumptions aren't biblically based, they will be based on some other source of authority. As we'll see, these other sources of authority form into worldviews that, while very different from one another, have a common thread. They are organized to push Christianity out of the public square. Following is a brief analysis of what some of those worldviews are and why they so stridently oppose Christian involvement in politics. Politics is one issue every worldview takes into account. Christianity is a dominant worldview, but in our volume, Understanding the Times, David Nobel and I examined 5 others: secularism, Marxism, postmodernism, New Spirituality, and Islam. Each of these worldviews plants certain seeds in hopes of harvesting certain kinds of fruit. Secularism produces government that ignores God. Marxism produces government that is hostile to God and confiscates goods from the wealthy and redistributes them to workers and so forth. You can temporarily decorate these worldviews with other kinds of fruit, but if you want different fruit, you must plant different seeds. Before we explore the kind of fruit a Christian worldview of politics ought to produce, let's dig into each of the other 5 worldviews to see what they've planted and what they hope to harvest. Secularism. In the words of philosopher Paul Kurtz, no deity will save us. We must save ourselves. We need saving, secularism says, but religion can't do it because faith and facts are 2 different worlds, and those who try to mix them do harm. Hunter Baker says in his critique of secularism, although the United States is one of the most religious of the developed nations, there is still an expectation among those who define public reality in the media, academy, and government that appeals to God should be saved for one's private life. To swim against the tide of secular modernity indicates one may be uncivil, unbalanced, and possibly even dangerous. Secularists don't mind if people are religious on their own time, but they think it's alarming when people bring God into the public sphere. Such people, secularists believe, must be strongly opposed. But if God is irrelevant, what are ethics and laws based on? Secularists say that human thinking and consensus are what make social progress possible. Secularists often draw on the philosophy of legal positivism, which says that what ought to be done in society is what people in authority think is best, rather than what is based on moral rules derived from nature or God's revelation. Not everyone thinks legal positivism is a good idea. Christian attorney and author John Whitehead observes, if there is no fixity in law and no reference point, then law can be what a judge says it is. If, however, there is a fixity to law, there is some absolute basis upon which judgment can be made. Without a fixed standard for what is right and wrong, secularists tend to look to outcomes rather than inputs to decide what to do. Take, for example, the Declaration of Independence's focus on the pursuit of happiness as an unalienable right. A government holding that laws are derived from nature and God's revelation will ask, is the government being restrained from infringing on the pursuit of happiness? A secularist who embraces legal positivism, though, asks, are people actually experiencing happiness? If not, it's up to the government to guarantee that people are happy. Secularist professor Mark Reeder wrote, in the end, politics is a place of public happiness. But as another secularist, Morris Storer, admits, it's not easy because the good life or quality of life is relative to each individual's preferences, desires, and needs. There are two ironies here. First, trying to guarantee outcomes practically guarantees that the government will grow larger and more powerful, drawing resources out of economically productive pursuits to feed itself. We've seen this happen in the federal government, which has spent $22 trillion in the past 50 years to conquer poverty, only to find that poverty is at the same level as before, and that the bureaucracy is many hundreds of times larger. Second, it's an impossible aim. No matter how big government becomes, it can never take care of everyone and make them all happy. We might have done well to heed the words of Thomas Jefferson and secularist hero, that good government is one which shall restrain men from injuring one another, shall leave them otherwise free to regulate their own pursuits of industry and improvement, and shall not take from the mouth of labor the bread it has earned. Secularists remain undeterred by reality, however. Believing government is the solution, they long to unite the nations to create a new world order. Paul Kurtz advocated a world parliament to enact legislative policies on behalf of global citizens, rather than their governments, as the current United Nations is tasked to do. Advocating a secularist approach, Julian Huxley thought humanity's evolution demanded this new approach. Major steps in the human phase of evolution are achieved by breakthroughs to new dominant patterns of mental organization of knowledge, ideas, and beliefs, ideological instead of physiological or biological organization. Kurt agreed, noting there are powerful forces moving us toward a new ethical global consciousness. Secularist philosopher Timothy Madigan says, world government is simply acknowledging a reality. It is no longer feasible to arbitrarily divide it into separate states and hope that each one can satisfactorily manage itself. In sum, secularists don't really care whether you believe in God as long as you keep it to yourself. Religion is based on opinions, secularists say, whereas good government is based on how well we can measure whether it's meeting people's felt needs. Even political philosophy, the college major designed to train people to be politically astute citizens, is now called political science. The assumption is that good government is a scientific pursuit rather than a thoughtful debate about what is right and wrong. This is a massive worldview shift. As journalist Christopher Caldwell says, political philosophy asks which government is best for man. Political science asks which government is best for government. Marxism. Many of America's founding fathers saw government as a concession to humanity's sin nature. If men were angels, said James Madison, no government would be necessary. Karl Marx and his followers, though, believed that men, those in the working class at least, were angels. Once the workers revolted, they would set the world on the path to a communist utopia and government would disappear. Marxists believe this revolution has already begun. Georgy Shakhnazarov, we're going with that, a top aide to former Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev, believed the Russian Revolution of October 1917 will continue until the means of production are in the hands of the people. This is the defining trend of our time. Our epoch is the epoch of the revolutionary transformation of capitalist society into communist. According to Marxists, then, the proletariat rules. Economic classes and governments will be abolished, and the world will experience cooperation and consensus. The church would also have to be abolished in this process because it is, as Clemens Dutt put it, diverting workers from the struggle against capitalism. On the surface, Marxists claim to support democracy, but they define the word in a different way. To the Marxists, democracy is simply the means to an end, a necessary tool for moving towards socialism and ultimately communism. Marxists feel safe with their version of democracy because they believe it will take power away from the elites and give it to the working class, which will then abolish democracy and establish the dictatorship of the proletariat, the people's dictatorship. The people's dictatorship will redefine everything, including the very definition of right and wrong. Right becomes whatever benefits the workers, and wrong becomes whatever harms their interests. Howard Selsom explained, Marxism, which has been so often accused of seeking to eliminate moral considerations from human life and history, emphasizes rather the moral issues involved in every situation. It does so, however, not by standing on a false platform of absolute right, but by identifying itself with the real needs and interests of the workers and farmers. Because the needs of workers and farmers change over time, what is right and wrong will also need adjustments. Morality is relative to what those in power think is best for workers and farmers. E.B. Pashukanis, I don't know, wrote, we require that our legislation possess maximum elasticity. We cannot fetter ourselves by any sort of system. To Pashukanis, it wasn't about the equal application of the law. It was about doing whatever is needed to get the results Marxist leaders want to achieve. Marxism teaches that the transformation to a people's dictatorship will be accomplished through a workers' revolution. Purified by their suffering, workers will have gained the moral authority to lead. Vladimir Lenin was clear that this kind of leadership would be a dictatorship, and it would be forceful. Whoever expects that socialism will be achieved without social revolution and a dictatorship of the proletariat is not a socialist. Dictatorship is state power based directly upon force. Historically, what happened is this. People didn't become saintly and wise just because they were poor and their jobs were hard. So, on their behalf, communist leaders formed a communist political party to make all the decisions for the working class. According to the authors of Socialism as a Social System, Marxist-Leninist theory and the experience of history show conclusively that the working class can carry out its historic mission only if led by a strong, well-organized party. But this is simply a cynical way for power-hungry rulers to seize control and justify it as a benefit to the people. Joseph Stalin wrote, "Our party guides the government. The party supervises the work of the administration and tries to secure for them the support of the masses, since there is not any important decision taken by them without the direction of the party." Inside the gift-wrapped package of the people's dictatorship was plain old-fashioned tyranny, and of the most brutal sort. Tens of millions of people perished, and Marxism now stands as the most brutal form of totalitarianism in all of human history, more brutal than all other forms combined. Secularism and Marxism are the most prevalent worldviews competing against the influence of Christians in government, but other worldviews do have something to say about politics. Let's take a brief look at postmodernism, new spirituality, and Islam. Postmodernism, an offshoot of Marxism, postmodernism developed as a means of deconstructing political and religious meta-narratives to expose the ways they persuade others to unthinkingly turn over the reins of power. Simply put, a meta-narrative is single, overarching interpretation of reality. To postmodernists, politics is bad, but religion is worse. Politics and religion together are intolerable. Religion is unobjectionable, and pragmatist philosopher and hero to postmodernists, Richard Rorty, as long as it is privatized. During his lifetime, Rorty felt this so strongly that he regularly quoted the French revolutionary Denis Diderot, "Man will never be free until the last king is strangled with the entrails of the last priest." Postmodernism has been influential in causing people to be cynical about the motives of those in power, but it hasn't generated a better form of government because postmodernism is primarily about critique rather than constructive change. Postmodernists are like armchair quarterbacks who yell at the television screen but wouldn't have the first idea of what to do if they were actually responsible for real results. New spirituality. Another worldview that is quite unlike the others and not as influential in the Western world as secularism and Marxism is New Spirituality. New Spirituality is a blanket term describing any view that applies Eastern religion to Western life. It says the universe is a living organism connected by higher consciousness, or what some people call God or the divine. Consciousness is seen as a unified field of energy that is self-contained, self-knowing, and self-sustaining. According to Robert Oates, it contains within it the seeds of all the force and matter fields in nature. To New Spiritualists, the good life comes from tapping into higher consciousness through meditation. Some New Spiritualists, including transcendental meditation advocate John Hagelin, believe that getting enough people to meditate on the same thing creates the Maharishi effect, named after TM's founder, the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. The Maharishi is quoted as saying, "It is not the system of government that is important. Every system can rise to fulfillment. Every system can bring satisfaction to the aspirations of all the people. The Maharishi effect, say its advocates, will generate the ideal society. It makes children smarter, lowers crime, and ends wars." What might stop us from harnessing higher consciousness in this way? According to New Spiritualist teacher Eckhart Tolle, it's our individual egos. Ego, Tolle says, is what sunk the communist revolution. Because communism didn't put any emphasis on changing people's inner realities, it couldn't overcome the dysfunction that egoistic people have brought into society. New Spiritualists have similar doubts about secularism and Islam and to some extent historical Christianity, at least in its formal high church sense. Even though many sympathize with its aims, New Spirituality simply doesn't have enough dedicated adherents to have much impact, directly at least. Indirectly, New Spirituality has influenced popular culture a great deal, as Philip Goldberg demonstrates in his book American Veda. Yoga studios are everywhere. People talk about karma. Meditation is a common practice. Teaching about the science of consciousness, which originated with Indian gurus, fills the airwaves on programs like The Oprah Winfrey Show and in best-selling books like The Secret by Rhonda Byrne. A new paganism is emerging to convince people that everything is one and that all distinctions must be eliminated. This means eliminating the distinction between ourselves and God, but it could also mean that the distinctions between male and female are artificial as well, as the distinctions between good and bad, between nations based on geographic boundaries, and so forth. This new paganism touches everything, including politics. Islam. The final world view we'll look at in our discussion of politics is Islam, a rapidly growing force in the Western world. Islam means submission, and adherents are called Muslims, which means those who submit. Islam is a comprehensive reality, a form of government as well as a religion that's governed by Sharia law. Sharia prescribes harsh punishments for what Islam considers crimes, including stealing and murder, as well as religious conversion from Islam and homosexual behavior. Yet the Muslim world is divided about how far to go in applying Sharia. Some Muslims favor nation-states, with laws, constitutions, and boundaries distinct from other nations, and others promote pan-Islam, a view that the Muslim community should unite and establish a global Islamic state. Those favoring the nation-state view sometimes produce nations where Sharia law dominates, but others, such as Turkey, are Muslim nations with a constitution not based solely on Islamic principles, though this is shifting as the character of national leadership changes. In these more moderate countries, though, are many who favor a pan-Islamic community and actively work to establish Sharia through reform, denouncement, protest, and even terrorism. In the last several decades, such groups have shaken many nations to their core, calling secularism into question and in many cases brutally asserting what they see as Allah's will over nations. One thing all non-Christian worldviews have in common. Though these worldview perspectives are very different, they all share the belief that Christianity has no place in the public realm. To secularism, Christianity is an outmoded way of thinking that prevents people from ordering society according to non-religious principles. To Marxism, Christianity is dangerous because it props up capitalism and prevents revolution. To postmodernism, Christianity is a false story of life that oppresses people. New Spirituality disagrees with Christianity about who God is, and it asserts that changing people's inner realities, not bringing biblical principles to bear in society, is what improves government. To Islam, Christians are infidels who must cease their rebellion against Allah and hand the keys of power over to followers of the Prophet Muhammad. In short, other worldviews see Christianity as an artifact of a bygone era, and perhaps one that has done more harm than good. Proponents of these other worldviews say it's time for Christians to mind their own business and stop meddling in politics. Deceived by these arguments, some Christians timidly step aside, but that's not the right thing to do. Instead of shrinking into the shadows, believers ought to do the hard work of discerning a biblical basis for political involvement and then become more involved, not less. Caring, not capitulation, is the answer. Section 3. Why should Christians care? Politics is often a touchy subject among Christians, but it shouldn't be. Christians played a formative role in developing ideas of good government, particularly representative democracy, the rule of law, and limited government. Interestingly, Christianity's concept of original sin also made a difference. Lord Acton coined the now famous phrase, "Power tends to corrupt. Absolute power corrupts absolutely." But it wasn't a new thought. Nearly 2,000 years before Lord Acton made his statement, the Apostle Paul wrote that no one is righteous. Humans cannot be trusted with too much power. Those who want power are especially suspect. Realizing this, America's founders divided power among 3 branches of government: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. This division balances power and checks its abuse. As Christians, we should welcome opportunities to participate in government. Our goal ought to be influencing the state to protect the innocent and punish the guilty according to what is actually true in reality, not what political pundits say to sound clever. Proverbs 11 states, "By the blessing of the upright a city is exalted, but by the mouth of the wicked is it overthrown." The Bible talks about government from cover to cover. Many theologians say government began in Genesis 9. Just after the account of Noah and the flood, God told Noah that if a man sheds the blood of another man, his punishment is to forfeit his own life. The particular point was about murder, but it implies law enforcement and a judicial system capable of judging guilt and innocence. My own view is that government began before that, in Genesis 2, when the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and keep it. The man was responsible for organizing his surroundings. That's government. If it's just one person, it's self-government. If it's a group, it might be one of the 3 kinds of government we'll consider in this chapter: civil, family, and church, which is a unique form of government organized around religious worship and practice. The church's responsibility, as we saw earlier, is to help the state be the state. We could also say that it helps the family be the family. The church is, or ought to be, the conscience of society. It may seem like a technical point, but if government began before Adam and Eve fell into sin, then it's part of God's creation, not just a response to sin. We need government not to keep everyone in line, but to free them to flourish. Even if humans hadn't fallen, we'd still have government to serve human society in the way that a traffic cop is needed to help regulate the flow of traffic, even when all the drivers are well-meaning and polite. God is truth. Justice is truth in relationships. Government is truth applied to community. The Mosaic Law, also called the Torah, is one of the earliest sources of written rules about government. It was a set of laws God gave the Israelites, newly freed from slavery, to govern themselves while surrounded by hostile nations and possessing no natural source of food and water. Survival was at stake. Reading this ancient law can be confusing, though. Civil laws about crime and punishment are mixed in with ceremonial laws about personal hygiene. It takes a great deal of discernment to understand how these laws apply to us, but the Christian tradition is that we may not simply ignore them because salvation comes through faith in Christ, not by obedience to the law. Jesus himself said, "I have not come to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them." Treating Old Testament law as if it's still relevant is odd to us. We can't imagine government regulations on the kinds of fabrics we can wear, the length of beards, and so forth. But as Jonathan Burnside, a professor at the University of Bristol, England, points out, the Torah tells a story about how life ought to be lived. Reading through the biblical texts as a legal scholar, Burnside asked what they contribute to our understanding of law, and found that the Torah has profoundly helpful insights into justice, taking care of the earth, property, welfare, criminal law, marriage and divorce, and sex. If we recognize the Bible as revealing something about God and what he wants, we can see 3 clear ways it can inform our own political involvement today. I'm going to stop there for a minute, make sure my dog didn't eat my cats.